Imagine a person walking through crowded streets with a distant gaze, as if they are in another world. They smile at social gatherings, but feel an inexplicable discomfort at the end of each meeting. Superficial conversations bore them, noisy environments exhaust them, and even when surrounded by people, they feel strangely alone. It's not about shyness, arrogance, or disinterest. It's something deeper, more structural. This feeling of disconnection, of not belonging, is a common symptom among individuals who share certain rare psychological traits. Traits that are not immediately visible but profoundly shape how this person perceives the world, others, and themselves. This video starts with an uncomfortable provocation. What if your difficulty in connecting with others is not a problem, but a direct consequence of rare and misunderstood psychological characteristics? And more, what if these same characteristics are, in fact, sources of strength and clarity in a world that values superficial performance and empty hyperconnectivity? For decades, traditional psychology has classified these individuals as shy, withdrawn, or socially dysfunctional. But more recent research, such as that of Dr. Elaine N, has brought forth a new perspective. Some people are neurologically and emotionally highly sensitive. They have more responsive nervous systems, brains that process information more deeply, and elevated levels of empathy and emotional awareness. What goes unnoticed by most is a sensory avalanche for them. What is merely a detail for others can be an overload for these individuals. This hypersensitivity is not only in the senses, but also in cognition, morality, and social perception. Such people tend to notice subtleties in tone of voice, facial expressions, and the emotional climates of environments. And because they absorb so much, they often need to isolate themselves to avoid internal collapse, hence the withdrawal. Not out of a lack of desire for connection, but out of a need for protection, a psychological mechanism that ensures mental survival. However, the modern world, noisy, fast, and increasingly appearance-driven, is not kind to those living in this heightened state of awareness. Society tends to reward performative extroversion, aggressive charisma, and constant sociability. And those who do not fit this model are quickly labeled as strange, closed off, or indifferent. But perhaps what these individuals carry is something the world has forgotten how to value: depth, true empathy, refined perception, radical authenticity. This video is a dive into this universe. We will explore 7 rare psychological traits that, according to contemporary studies and theories, are strongly associated with the feeling of social disconnection. It is not about pathologizing behaviors, but about illuminating characteristics that need to be understood with maturity. And, above all, offering a new narrative for all those who, in silence, feel that they do not belong. If you have ever wondered why you feel out of place, even among loved ones, why social fatigue seems chronic, or why you long for deeper and more genuine connections, perhaps this video is exactly what you needed to hear. Because maybe you're not alone. Maybe you are just part of a silent minority that sees the world with more intensity than it can bear. Behind the silence of those who feel disconnected often lies a story marked by misunderstanding. From a very early age, these individuals, highly sensitive, intense, and introspective, were taught, directly or indirectly, that there was something wrong with them. Phrases like, "You think too much," "Don't take everything so seriously," or "Stop being so dramatic," are more than mere comments. They are small, emotional aggressions that, repeated throughout childhood, transform into an invisible trauma. A trauma that leaves no physical scars but deeply shapes identity and social behavior. Dr. Elaine N, in her work The Highly Sensitive Person, describes how individuals with high neurological sensitivity tend to register childhood events with amplified intensity. For these people, situations that would be fleeting for others, such as criticism, a change of environment, or family conflict, are experienced as deeply significant events. The result is a mind that develops with constant hypervigilance, always alert to potential rejections, judgments, and discomforts. This excess of emotional and sensory stimulation is recorded early in the nervous system, generating a defensive behavioral pattern. The sensitive child learns to stay silent to avoid confrontations, to hide to avoid being noticed, to read the environment with extreme caution before acting. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic. The adult resulting from this internal journey may be highly perceptive but also chronically exhausted. They may be empathetic but deeply lonely. They may have a vast inner world but struggle greatly to feel part of the outer world. The trauma of hypersensitivity is not the trauma of a single event, but the daily accumulation of emotional microaggressions. It is the fatigue of being misunderstood, the pain of not being heard, the frustration of living in a world that considers depth a disadvantage. And when this wound goes unrecognized, it transforms into silent shame. The person begins to see themselves as weak, dysfunctional, or socially inadequate. This creates a cycle of withdrawal, reinforcing the distancing from others, not out of arrogance but out of self-preservation. The problem lies not in sensitivity itself, but in how society deals with it. We live in a culture that glorifies excess, extreme productivity, constant exposure, quick responses, controlled emotions. In this scenario, any sign of introspection, hesitation, or vulnerability is seen as a flaw. Sensitivity, which could be a bridge to more human and profound connections, becomes a social burden. And the sensitive individual, realizing this, withdraws even further, seeking protection in solitude, but often finding a wrenching sense of disconnection. Therefore, it is essential to understand the distancing these individuals feel is not weakness nor moral superiority. It is a direct reflection of an environment that constantly overwhelms and invalidates them. They did not choose to disconnect. They were pushed away by a world that does not know how to embrace them. But there is more. This sensitivity does not only affect how these individuals experience emotions. It profoundly shapes the way they think, process information, and react to the subtlest stimuli of everyday life. And it is precisely this that we will explore in the next part. The rare and often misunderstood trait of depth of processing, a characteristic that transforms every thought into an intense journey and every social interaction into an emotional minefield. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Among all the rare traits that manifest in people who feel disconnected from the world, perhaps none is as determining as depth of processing, a powerful yet exhausting cognitive mechanism that transforms every experience into an almost infinite sequence of reflections, analyses, and meanings. For those who carry this trait, nothing is merely what it seems. Everything needs to be understood in its essence, investigated in multiple layers, connected to an internal system of values, past experiences, and future predictions. And this comes at a cost. Dr. Elaine N describes this trait as the cornerstone of high sensitivity. Individuals with this characteristic do not just observe the world, they process it deeply, even without realizing it. Imagine that the brains of these people function like ultra-high precision radars, capturing nuances that most ignore. Tones of voice, micro-expressions, changes in the environment, subtle contradictions in discourse. Nothing goes unnoticed, even what is on the margins of the obvious. This mechanism makes them intuitive, reflective, and often visionary. But it also makes them mentally exhausted. It's as if every everyday situation becomes a field of study. A trivial conversation can generate hours of internal analysis. Was I clear enough? Why did she hesitate before responding? He seemed uncomfortable. Was I intrusive? This excess of processing is not a choice. It is a neurological pattern. And when combined with constant social interactions, it creates an invisible weariness, a kind of social cognitive fatigue that, if not respected, leads to emotional collapse. And this is where the feeling of disconnection begins to solidify. When everything is felt and analyzed with such depth, the lightness of common human interactions can seem too superficial. Small talk, automatic social rituals, encounters that happen out of obligation, all of this sounds empty, forced. And then, the one who processes too much begins to avoid socializing, not out of arrogance, but because they find no truth in the connections. It's like seeking water in the desert and finding only mist. Furthermore, depth of processing is closely linked to a tendency toward introspection and self-criticism. These individuals often revisit their mistakes, rework painful memories, and try to understand the reasons behind each choice, each failure, each silence. This can lead to emotional growth, but it can also trap them in spirals of rumination. And when the external environment demands speed, quick responses, and impulsive action, the deep thinker feels out of place, inadequate, out of sync with the rhythm of the world. However, this same depth that isolates also illuminates. People with this trait possess an extraordinary ability to see hidden connections, to understand complex moral dilemmas, to anticipate consequences, and to dive into ideas with an almost philosophical intensity. Many artists, writers, therapists, scientists, and spiritual leaders share this characteristic. The world needs these minds, but rarely understands them. The result of all this is a rich, intense inner life, but often lonely. Because those who live in depth feel strange in a world obsessed with the surface, and so fatigue accumulates. Socializing becomes an effort, disconnection turns into refuge, and silence becomes the only safe space. But it doesn't stop there. There is another equally powerful, and even more delicate, trait that contributes to this distancing from the world: extreme empathy. The ability to feel not only one's own inner world, but also the emotional world of others. And when this empathy is unregulated, it transforms into an invisible burden, a constant battlefield between others' pain and one's own emotional limits. This is exactly what we will explore in the next part. There is something noble in the ability to feel another's pain. Empathy has always been celebrated as a morally elevated trait, an essential virtue for human coexistence. But what happens when this empathy is so intense, so visceral, that it begins to silently consume the one who carries it? For many people who feel disconnected from the world, the answer lies precisely here, in extreme, unregulated empathy that transforms them not only into observers of others' emotions, but into true emotional sponges, absorbing the suffering of everyone around them. People with this trait not only perceive the feelings of others, they feel them as if they were their own. They are in a restaurant and pick up on the tension between the couple at the next table. They are in a work meeting and notice the discomfort of the quiet colleague, the disguised insecurity of the boss, the unspoken fatigue of the team. And they do not just perceive, they suffer with it. It's as if the emotional field of the other invades their nervous system and settles there, without asking for permission. Studies in emotional neuroscience confirm this. The heightened activation of the insula, an area of the brain related to emotional awareness, is significantly more intense in highly sensitive individuals, especially when exposed to social stimuli, such as sad facial expressions or distressed tones of voice. It's as if these brains are neurologically programmed for emotional altruism, but without filters. And when this empathy is not accompanied by healthy psychological boundaries, it becomes a slow-acting poison. This type of empathy does not allow for disconnection. It is always active, always picking up, always feeling. And the cost of this is chronic emotional exhaustion. These people often carry burdens that are not theirs, cry for pains they have not lived, and enter states of anxiety or sadness that, when investigated, reveal themselves to be echoes of emotions absorbed from others. This inevitably leads to a behavior of withdrawal. They begin to avoid large groups, prolonged social situations, emotionally charged environments, and the more they avoid, the lonelier they become. But the paradox is cruel, because despite the distancing, the desire for connection remains. And it is precisely this contradiction that tears them apart. How to connect with another when the other unwittingly hurts just by existing emotionally beside them? How to create bonds when loving inevitably means suffering together? Extreme empathy is, therefore, an ambivalent trait. On one hand, it confers a rare sensitivity, a deep capacity for acceptance, listening, and true compassion. Such people are often sought out as confidants, informal therapists, natural advisors. On the other hand, this same ability can lead them to self-annihilation, emotional codependence, and psychological collapse, not due to a lack of strength, but from an excess of openness. And there's more. The greater the empathy, the greater the intolerance for emotional falseness. People with this trait can tell when a smile is forced, when a compliment is strategic, when presence is merely performance. This makes them extremely selective, not out of elitism, but for psychic survival. And it is precisely this selectivity that leads us to the next rare and often misunderstood trait: radical authenticity and aversion to superficiality. A trait that challenges social logic and deepens the chasm between the sensitive and the world around them. This is what we will discuss next. In the midst of concrete, haste, noise, and the artificiality of modern daily life, nature has become a forgotten luxury. Most people spend days, sometimes weeks, without putting their bare feet on the ground, without looking directly at the sky, without touching something that hasn't been manufactured. And the most alarming thing is that they don't even realize what they are missing. The human body, the human mind, human attention. All of this evolved in close contact with the natural world. When we disconnect from nature, we don't just lose trees, sun, and wind. We lose rhythm, we lose presence, we lose mental health. Byung-Chul Han points out that contemporary society has lost the rituals of transition between natural cycles. Day and night have ceased to have meaning because screens illuminate the early morning as if it were noon. The seasons have been erased by constant air conditioning. Rain has become an inconvenience. Wind has become a distraction. Time has become a tyrant. And when there is no longer a connection with the rhythms of the world, the modern subject begins to live in a continuous and shallow present, where everything seems the same, and anxiety settles in as a permanent background noise. That is why deliberate exposure to nature is a radical form of healing. It is not a sensory indulgence. It is a physiological and psychological necessity. Walking outdoors for 20 minutes, without headphones, without podcasts, without music, just letting the eyes absorb the textures, the contrasts of light, the sound of birds, the rustling of leaves, is enough for the nervous system to slow down. Heart rate decreases, brain activity changes, attention begins to reorganize. And perhaps for the first time in the day, the subject finally feels present. But it's not just about going out to get some fresh air. It's about being in nature with intention, placing oneself as an observer, not as a user, noticing the movement of clouds, the imperfections of a leaf, the smell of the earth after rain. This type of experience activates in the brain a mode of contemplative attention that is the opposite of digital overstimulation. While scrolling fragments, nature unifies. While the feed accelerates, the wind soothes. While the screen fatigues, the green restores. And most importantly, nature is, by definition, unpredictable. One sky is never the same as the previous day. The sound of the wind varies. Colors change throughout the hours. This constant micro-variation is what subtly and profoundly nourishes the mind. By returning to nature, even for a few daily minutes, you restore to your perception a sense of real novelty. not manufactured, not packaged by algorithms. Novelty that surprises, that nourishes, that truly satisfies. And perhaps you will notice something curious. After a few days of walking without distraction, your urge to grab your phone begins to diminish. Not out of guilt, not out of obligation, but because something inside you begins to be filled again. However, this reconnection with the external reality also requires a reconnection with the internal reality. And most people, accustomed to constant distraction, have lost the ability to be with their own thoughts without fleeing. Therefore, in the next step, we will talk about what may be the most difficult challenge, but also the most transformative. Relearning to do absolutely nothing for a few minutes each day. Because only when you are doing nothing do you truly begin to exist. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Imagine living with an internal mirror that never turns off, reflecting every gesture, every word spoken, every decision made. Now imagine that this mirror not only reflects but analyzes, judges, corrects and loops everything you have done and left undone. This is the silent reality of many people who feel disconnected from the world. They do not just think, they overthink. They do not just feel guilt, they ruminate on guilt. They do not just seek to improve, they obsessively criticize themselves for not being good enough. This is the universe of hyper-awareness of self and psychological perfectionism. Elevated self-awareness, when well integrated, can be a force for growth, reflection, and wisdom. But when combined with high sensitivity and a history of emotional invalidation, it becomes an internal minefield. The individual begins to obsessively review their words, their actions, their past mistakes. A simple interaction can generate hours of rumination. Why did I say that? Was I misinterpreted? Did I seem arrogant? Did I hurt someone without realizing it? This continuous internal vigilance drains emotional reserves. And the most tragic part? No one outside notices. Because externally, these people continue to function, completing tasks, smiling, while inside, they wage silent battles against their own minds. This elevated level of self-perception is directly linked to the trait of depth of processing, but it takes on a crueler form. Instead of using this ability to understand the world, it turns inward, like an unrelenting magnifying glass that exposes flaws, insecurities, and imaginary imperfections. Perfectionism here is not just a desire to do well. It is an internal conviction that only by achieving an almost impossible standard will one be accepted, loved, and respected. This standard is often instilled in childhood, especially in sensitive individuals who grew up in environments where they were misunderstood. Children who felt too much, cried easily, became deeply frustrated, and were labeled as dramatic, complicated, or exaggerated. Instead of being embraced, they were met with demands. And so they learned that they would only be worthy of affection if they were impeccable. The sensitive child grows up trying to be perfect to avoid being rejected again. And this effort crystallizes in adulthood as a constant mental model of self-sabotage and self-criticism. The problem is that, in trying to avoid mistakes, the individual ends up avoiding life. They postpone projects for fear of failure. They silence opinions for fear of seeming inadequate. They avoid relationships for fear of not being good enough. They live in defensive mode. And every step outside the comfort zone is followed by a tsunami of self-demand that drains any possibility of lightness. This state of emotional alertness, this inability to simply be without needing to prove oneself, further distances these individuals from social interaction. After all, if being among others means being constantly evaluated, and if you already evaluate yourself so harshly, the world outside becomes a threat arena. Better to withdraw, avoid, isolate, and thus the feeling of disconnection deepens, fueled by an internal voice that never silences. But there is a crucial detail. Behind this destructive perfectionism lies a legitimate desire to belong. There is a heart that only wants to be accepted as it is, but has learned to mutilate itself to fit in. And however distorted this mechanism may seem, it arises from the yearning for true connection. A yearning that, ironically, coexists with a deep fear of falseness in relationships. It is this paradox that leads us to the next and final, rare trait. The one that unites all the previous ones and reveals the truth behind the loneliness felt by these individuals. The intense desire for deep, genuine connections, but which almost never materialize. Because when you live with such intensity, any superficial relationship hurts. And that is exactly what we will talk about next. Deep down, even the most introspective, sensitive, and reclusive people desire, above all, connection. Not just any kind of connection, but one that is true, raw, and emotionally honest. The kind of bond that goes beyond words, that doesn't require performance, that embraces essence without filters. For many, this desire is like a flame that never goes out, even in the face of all the frustrations, separations, and accumulated wounds. But for those who carry the traits we have explored so far, this search for deep connection is marked by a singular pain. The more they wish to connect, the more distant they feel from the real world. This is the central paradox of these individuals. They are seen as cold, yet they feel everything excessively. They seem distant, but they carry an open heart. They flee from crowds, yet they beg for genuine intimacy. And the reason is simple. They cannot stand shallow relationships. For them, it is not enough to be together. One must be present. It is not enough to talk. One must commune. It is not enough to exchange words. One must exchange truths. This level of emotional demand is not something that can be turned off. It is rooted in the psychic structure of these individuals. And for this reason, throughout life, they accumulate a collection of disappointments. They try to open up, but are misunderstood. They show vulnerability, but receive superficiality in return. They begin to trust, but realize that the other is not really there. And each new frustration digs a chasm between what they offer and what they receive, a chasm between the vast internal world and the hurried external world. Over time, a defense emerges, voluntary emotional isolation, not out of pride, but out of exhaustion, not out of misanthropy, but out of self-protection. These individuals begin to live in their own universe, surrounded by books, art, nature, silence, anything that offers depth without demanding weariness. And although this refuge is often necessary, it also becomes a prison, because despite everything, the desire for connection remains there, latent, burning. But this disconnection is not a personal failure. It is, in fact, the side effect of a mind and a soul that operate on another level of perception. As E.M. Forster said, quoted at the beginning of the book, The Highly Sensitive Person, there is a secret aristocracy among the sensitive and the considered. They recognize each other when they meet. Yes, you may feel alone. Yes, it may seem that no one understands you. But there are others like you. People who feel too much, think too much, love too much. And this channel exists precisely for that. To remind you that your sensitivity is not a flaw. It is a gift. Rare, deep, and absolutely necessary in a world that desperately needs more truth. If you see yourself reflected in this video, if these words touch something that was silent inside you, then write in the comments, "I also feel too much." Share your experience. Your comment may be exactly what someone else needed to read to not feel so alone. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, you don't have to pretend to be someone you're not. Here, You will always be welcome, just as you are. Oh, and don't stop here. The next video is just as important as this one. Keep watching. You deserve to understand everything that lies behind what you feel. Your journey is just beginning.